has been a privilege and pleasure to work with the Atlanta C.S. Lewis Institute over the years and do some teachings and seminars there. And one of the reasons is because in my work at Bethlehem College and Seminary, there's a pretty good resonance with what the C.S. Lewis Institute and what we're trying to do. And part of that is a shared love of Lewis. Lewis has been a close companion of mine since I was a boy, a lad, growing up in West Texas and reading the Narnian Chronicles. I distinctly remember I was probably in junior high. I don't remember exactly how old I was, but I remember reading Mere Christianity and trying to explain the argument for God's existence from the moral law, because it really, like, I could tell it was this really amazing thing, and trying my best to explain it to them and having them just look at me like, you're cute, kid. They didn't get it. They didn't, because I didn't explain it well. So Lewis has been a friend and companion for all these years, and Narnia is one of the main reasons for that. I read those books. My mom gave them to me as a kid, and I read them all through college. And then when I came to Bethlehem as a student in 2005, sometime I think probably around 2006, 2007, I picked them back up, and I don't even remember why I did, but I started rereading them and noticing. Of course, I'd noticed all of a number of the deeper spiritual elements to the stories. I think I actually wrote a paper in high school on some of the Christian symbolism. But in reading, I thought, man, this would be great to teach a class on this. And so I set out to do that here at Bethlehem. I taught one for Bethlehem Baptist Church a number of years ago. And then that project eventually led in around 2013. I think it was the 50th anniversary of Lewis's death. Desiring God was putting on a conference on C.S. Lewis, and I was asked to speak on Narnia, and I was really excited to do that. And in preparation, I thought, now's the time. Not only am I going to give this one talk on Narnia, I want to finally write this book. I taught this class a number of times, and so that's where KJ mentioned this book here, "Live Like a Narnian: Christian Discipleship in Lewis's Chronicles." And this is the first book I wrote. It was by far the most fun book that I've ever written. I've written about 5 or 6 now. And this was way fun. It took me about 3 months to do it. And the way I did it actually was I would read the stories, sketch out. I had my notes from my class that I taught. And then I would sort of organize. I'm going to do 2 or 3 chapters per chronicle and try to organize the major themes. And then I would write the chapters, and then I would invite my students over. So I was teaching undergraduates at the time, and I would invite them over to my house for pizza in Narnia. And we had really cheap Little Caesars pizza, and would sit around, and I would read the chapters, and then we'd talk about it. So it was book club like. So this is very, this is taking me back, although we were in person, not on Zoom. And then I get feedback, incorporate that, what was clear, what was not clear. And from that emerged this little book. And so for tonight, part of what I want to do is, I'll jump off of a number of the themes that I talk about in the book. And if you like what you're hearing or want to follow up on it, feel free to pick that one up. I actually just recorded the audiobook. First time I ever got to record my own audiobook over the summer for that one after about 7 years. And so if you like audiobooks, you can listen to that one as well. It was very fun. So I want to orient us a little bit in this way. First, I wanted to talk a little bit about the order of the books. So here, the C.S. Lewis Institute said, "Hey, would you do these, and what chronicles do you want to do, and what order do you want to do them in?" And I said, there is only one order. There's only one right order, and all of the publishers are wrong. So if you have an edition of the Chronicles, I would be willing to bet, if it's a recent edition, say published in the last 30 years, it probably, the book with the number 1 on the side is going to be The Magician's Nephew. If you go back and you were to get an older collection of books, you might find from like the 70s. I've got a couple of these. I kind of collect them. My kids each have one, and I've got one, and so they're kind of collector's items. You'll notice that it begins with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And so there's a debate among Lewis scholars. And although I don't know that I've ever met a serious Lewis scholar who holds to the modern ordering that the publishers use. But here's the basic scenario. Lewis published them in this order: Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Prince Caspian, Voyage of the Dawn Treader, Silver Chair, Horse and His Boy, Magician's Nephew, and The Last Battle. That was the original publication order. But in a letter, a young boy named Lawrence wrote him a letter. And I forget what year the letter was from. But Lawrence said that he had gotten in an argument with his mom about what order they should be read in, because, of course, Magician's Nephew is the Narnian creation story. And so Lawrence was arguing, I should start with the creation story and then go to Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And his mother was saying, no, read them in publication order. That's the order they were released in. And so Lawrence, wrote Lewis a letter and said, which, am I right or my mom? And Lewis wrote back and he said that Lawrence was correct. And that the proper ordering, or the order that Lewis would recommend, was that publication order. Now, and then he went on to say something like, but really it doesn't matter which order you read it in, as long as you enjoy the book, something like that. And so because of that statement, and then because of a few other things toward the end of his life, publishers started to package them together with Magician's Nephew at the front. Now, it's an odd thing to disagree with an author about the order, but I actually think there are some objective reasons why, especially when you introduce children to the books for the first time, which is really where this matters the most, that you really ought to begin with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And there are a number of reasons that I could point to. I'm going to give you two, one from The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and one from The Magician's Nephew. So I'll give you The Magician's Nephew first. In The Magician's Nephew, there's a scene towards the end of the book in which Jadis, the witch queen from Charn, has torn off a piece of lamppost when she was in London, and then when they got into Narnia, she still had that lamppost, and she at one point throws it at Aslan. It hits him in the head, doesn't faze him. It falls into the ground, and a little while later, a lamppost sprouts up, and the symbolism there, of course, is that Narnia is this new world. It's fresh. It's fertile. And so, at that time, if you plant anything, it was going to grow up, right? And so you planted an iron bar from a lamppost, and you get a new lamppost. And in that, after that scene, or later in the story, you get this line: "The lamppost, which the witch had planted without knowing it, shone day and night in the Narnian forest, so that the place where it grew came to be called Lantern Waste. And when, many years later, another child from our world got into Narnia on a snowy night, she found the light still burning. And that adventure was, in a way, connected with the ones I have just been telling you." Now, at some level, Lewis there is assuming that you know something about Lantern Waste, and he assumes that there was another child who got into Narnia on a snowy night, and that she came across the lamppost, and on and on. And so this is a prequel, which assumes you've already seen or read the other book. Okay, so that's one argument, is that in writing the story that way, Lewis is assuming you've already familiar with Narnia, and this is giving you more background and detail. But that passage doesn't make as much sense if this is the first Narnian book you've ever read. Even more importantly, though, than that, someone might say, well, that's because he wants you to read the next book next. Read the story about the girl who got into Narnia on a snowy night. That's book 2. Well, here's the major problem with that. In The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, there's an important scene in the middle of the book when the children meet the beavers. Okay, and Mr. Beaver is drawing them in, and they're hiding because the witch has spies everywhere. And he's trying to get them to be quiet. And then at one point he asks them to lean in, and they all lean in. And he says, I'm supposed to take you somewhere because they say Aslan is on the move. Perhaps has already landed. Okay. This is a very important scene. And now here's the key line. So I want you to think about this in terms of the ordering. And now a very curious thing happened. None of the children knew who Aslan was any more than you do. But the moment the beaver had spoken these words, everyone felt quite different. Perhaps it sometimes happened to you in a dream that someone says something which you don't understand, but in the dream it feels as if it had some enormous meaning, either a terrifying one which turns the whole dream into a nightmare, or else a lovely meaning too lovely to put into words, which makes the dream so beautiful that you remember it all your life and are always wishing you could get into that dream again. It was like that now. At the name of Aslan, each one of the children felt something jump in its inside. Edmund felt a sensation of mysterious horror. Peter felt suddenly brave and adventurous. Susan felt as if some delicious smell or some delightful strain of music had just floated by her. And Lucy got the feeling you have when you wake up in the morning and realize that it is the beginning of the holidays or the beginning of summer. Now, the important thing there, right, is that Lewis has just for the first time in the books dropped the name Aslan on you. And he says, none of the children knew who Aslan was any more than you do. Now, that's not true if this is book 2. If you've already read The Magician's Nephew, you know perfectly well who Aslan is. And even more so later in Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, when Lucy asks, who is Aslan? Tell us more about him. And the beaver says, well, he's the king. And Susan says, well, is he a man? Of course he's not a man. Don't you know who the king of the beasts is? He's a lion. Oh, is he safe? Of course he's not safe, but he's good, right? That whole scene, very powerful, important scene in the books, is kind of the punch is taken out of that section of the book if you are already perfectly familiar with who Aslan is and who the lion is. And I think, I really do believe this, I think that this scene, this sort of awakening of desire, they say Aslan is on the move, and you don't know who Aslan is, but the children feel, strange things inside at the mention of his name. And then later they're, oh yeah, tell us more about him. And oh, he's a lion. And all of that kind of build up and anticipation. I think Lewis intended that. I think he wanted readers, when they first come to his book, to have something stir inside of them as they join the children in the stories in anticipating who is Aslan. And that effect is lost if you begin with Magician's Nephew. Now, once you've read the stories and you know who Aslan was, it doesn't matter, right? You already know who Aslan was. But for me, it was really important when my kids were little, they're still little, but when they were first exposed to the stories, that they read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe first, because I was hoping and desiring that when they got to that scene, they would really feel the emotion of that moment, that they would be awakened to something and desiring and leaning in to who Aslan is, and that there would be the payoff when he appears on the scene. So that's the reason for the order that we've chosen: Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Prince Caspian, and so forth, publication order. And someone might ask, maybe last little bit on this, someone might ask, well, then why did Lewis say that? Why did he tell Lawrence that Magician's Nephew should go first? I think there's two possible reasons. One, if a 9-year-old writes you a letter and it says, is my right or my mom right? You can humor him. And maybe Lewis was just humoring him. I also think that he might have forgotten. It's entirely possible that he forgot the intent he had with all of these sort of little but significant details, and didn't remember that, oh yeah, if they read Magician's Nephew first, they'll miss that moment. And I'd like to think that if someone had sat down with him after he wrote that letter, or after the publisher said, hey, we want to switch this order up, if someone had sat down with Lewis and said, hey, what about this scene right here? This loses its punch. That he would have said, oh, absolutely, you're right. Can't believe I missed that. Keep it in the original order. All right, enough on order. Second element I want to talk about, and just so you know how this is going to go, I'm going to present a number of different dimensions here about what the stories are, a couple of key scenes and themes from the book, and then we'll open up to some Q&A. So if you've got questions, I hope you're dropping them in the chat box, and the C.S. Lewis Institute folks are going to be sorting through those, and we'll be able to talk a little bit more about some of these questions. Now, second questions that I've got is, what are the Chronicles and what are they for? And this is the reason that I wrote the book, I am a better husband, a better father, a better Christian, a better friend because of my time spent in Narnia. It did things to me before I even knew it. And this too was intentional on Lewis's part, right? There's a famous quote, it's one of the more famous quotes from Lewis about that. Let me pull it up here so I don't butcher it. Where is it? There we go. One of the challenges he had as a Christian was this principle: obligation freezes feelings. Okay? Obligation freezes feelings. Now, I teach at a school that's a Christian hedonist school that exists to spread a passion for the supremacy of God in all things, for the joy of all peoples through Jesus Christ. So we're all about joy. We think that joy is commanded and that you ought to seek your highest joy in God himself. And Lewis discovered that as soon as you put that ought, that obligation on those feelings, the feelings kind of freeze up or they die. And so he said, but he recognized that God's a hedonist at heart and he wants us to enjoy him. And so how do you deal with the fact that the obligation kills the very thing that's trying to be produced? Well, here's what he said. I thought I saw how stories of this kind could steal past a certain inhibition which paralyzed much of my own religion as a child. Why did one find it so hard to feel as one was told one ought to feel about God or about the sufferings of Christ? I thought the chief reason was that one was told one ought to. Obligation can freeze feelings. The whole subject was associated with lowered voices, almost as if it were something medical. But here's the key. Suppose casting all of these things, now, what is these things? All of these things meaning the truths about God and about the sufferings of Christ, cast all of these things into an imaginary world, stripping them of their stained glass and Sunday school associations, one could make them for the first time appear in their real potency. Could one not thus steal past the watchful dragons? I thought one could. And so a major reason, the books began with sort of a bubbling of images. He sort of had a picture of a fawn carrying an umbrella with Christmas presents, and then a picture of a lion and a snowy wood and a lamppost and all this sort of stuff. And then he started arranging it into a story. And then as he was doing that, he said, this kind of story might be able to sneak past that inhibition that hinders the feelings, that freezes the feelings, by taking the substance of the Christian faith, the realities about who God is and about what Jesus has done, and putting him in imaginary form. It might awaken us to their real potency and steal past those watchful dragons so that we feel what we ought to feel about what God has done. And so in that way, the stories are not replacements for the gospel story, but they're a lens through which we can see the real potency of the gospel. And so all of the, this doesn't mean that you should go in and try to identify every Christian correspondence. There's a place for that. I'm going to do that here in a minute. But instead, that we should know that as we're reading these stories, as we're, say, introducing them to our children, we want them to immerse themselves in the stories as stories. Like, we want them to trek across the Narnian countryside, swim Narnian seas, figure out the difference between a centaur and a satyr and a faun. All of those things are really important. Let them live and soak in the stories. So breathe Narnian air. And then, having done that, having learned our Narnian stars, having feasted at Cair Paravel, that's once we've stolen past the watchful dragons, then we can turn our attention to those deeper Christian layers of meaning that had bubbled up in Lewis's mind. So that's my approach to these books is first enjoy them simply as stories. They're just good stories. They're wonderful fairy tales. I suspect they will be some very long-lasting fairy tales. They're deep and rich and powerful. And then, having been shaped by them, then, well, how was I shaped? What was I shaped into? And so maybe with that, we can turn to, so maybe one more note on that. You might think then of the Narnian Chronicles in one of two ways. They might be seen as a kind of preparation for the gospel, okay? Sort of John the Baptist-like. This is a way of seeding the substance and the realities of the substance of the Christian faith in seed form for people who maybe don't even know it. And that may have been some of you. I've known that there were, I've known non-Christians who read the books, loved them, had no idea there was anything Christian in them until they were much older. And so there may be a way that this is sowing seeds that may not flower until later. But Lewis thought this was really important in shaping our loves and shaping the kind of people we are. I'm going to talk more about that in a moment. So in one way, they could be preparatory for receiving the gospel and seeing Jesus as the true lion. The other thing, though, is enrichment. So not just preparation to receive the gospel for the first time, but having already done so, to sort of have our faith deepened, strengthened, and enriched by seeing those same truths embodied in a different way, in a fictional fairy tale sort of way. And so that's how I approach these books. And with that, let me turn to a couple of my favorite themes from this particular book, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. First, a couple of like minor notes. So in preparation for tonight, I went back and I listened to the audiobook again for the 100 and something time. I don't know how many times I've listened to these books. But one of the things that I noticed this time is, and I appreciate more now that I've written, I write more often as an adult, is the simplicity and clarity of Lewis's prose and the details he includes. I think that's intentional. So there may be some aspiring writers here in this seminar. And one of the things that you can learn from Lewis is the importance of being simple, clear, and concrete. And here's the sort of thing I mean. If you notice in that quote I read earlier about what they felt when they heard the name of Aslan, he chooses to help you get a sense of what they felt. He tries to connect it to experiences you might have had. So sometimes he just says Peter felt brave and adventurous, and you go, yeah, I don't know what that meant. But Lucy, you'll notice, has the feeling that you have when you wake up and you realize it's the holidays, it's summer. And so there's a real concreteness to that feeling. And if you read the books carefully, you'll notice that sort of concreteness again and again and again, where he'll say, imagine this. Imagine, I don't know if you've ever felt the way Lucy and Susan felt in that moment, say when Aslan was killed. I don't know if you've ever felt that way, but if you have, then you know that there comes a point after you've cried all your tears when a quietness settles in on you. And it's like there's a concrete realness that Lewis is trying to create. I've felt that. I've cried my eyes out like that. And know that kind of stillness and quietness that settles in when we're exhausted from our tears. And so that concreteness is really important. The second is the specificity. It's funny that, and he's writing for children and he knows it. And so at the very beginning, he notes these children, their names were Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy. Okay, so he gives you their names, and that kids want to know, what are their names? And then he mentions that they were sent away during the Blitz to stay with an old professor at a country house. And he had a housekeeper named Mrs. McCready. And also that they had 3 other housekeepers whose names were, their names were 3 servants. Their names were Ivy, Margaret, and Betty, but they don't come into this story very much. But just that little detail is meant to kind of give a realness to the story. It's the sort of thing that if you mention there are 3 servants, kids want to know what were their names. And so Lewis said, I better give them names. And so there's a way of writing with a kind of directness, simplicity, and concreteness that I think Lewis really mastered. I think you see that also in the scene where in The Thaw, the great extended scene in which the witch's magic is finally broken because Aslan is on the move. I'm saying this right now as I sit here in Minnesota in January, which is always winter, never Christmas. Although, let's see if we can do this real quick. We do still have our Christmas tree up, so we're fighting the White Witch even here in January. But as the thaw is happening and Aslan's magic is undoing the witch's magic, there's this extended scene where he's going into extensive detail about the waters bubbling and gurgling and rushing and the snow melting off the trees and the birds starting to fly and what particular birds they were and what kind of trees they saw. Look, there's a birch, there's a beech, there's an oak, all of that kind of detail. And it's meant to kind of give you a full imaginative, immersive experience. He's not just telling you it was amazing. He's making you feel the amazement. It's actually some of the advice he gave to aspiring writers. Don't tell me that something was amazing. Make me say amazing whenever I read your description. And he's really, really good at this. So that's some little details. Now let's talk a little bit about some major themes in these stories. One of them, here's a fun story about Lewis's reach. So the White Witch obviously is a very, very powerful character. I think she's become emblematic. Lewis, of course, he's not the first to talk about a White Witch or a Snow Queen. He gets that from Hans Christian Andersen. And so he's just taking up these things. He's borrowing and stealing from all over the place, which is what a good artist does. But you have this White Witch, and you have, she has a secret police, and she's keeping Narnia under her thumb, and it's always winter, never Christmas. And so here's the little side story. over the years, I've, been able to kind of mingle in some different C.S. Lewis circles. And one of the more surprising ones to me anyway, was there is a significant, I don't know, movement, I don't know what you call it, of C.S. Lewis lovers, in particular Narnia lovers, in the country of Romania, which is in Eastern Europe. And which might surprise you, like that's a really weird place for Narnia to be prominent and powerful. But years ago, I got asked by some friends to come over. They're Romanian, and they said, "Would you come over and be a part of this Narnia conference that they do every year?" And I said, "Sure, happy to do it." So I went over there, and I got to hear the story of why is Narnia a thing here in Romania? And apparently, what happened was back during the Cold War, Romania was on the other side of the Iron Curtain, meaning it was under the thumb of the Soviets, okay, the communists. And they had a dictator named Ceausescu, I think that's how you pronounce his name. And he was the dictator, and he had a wife, and both of them were notoriously evil people, okay? Prison camps and torture and things like secret police, okay? So at one point, there was a woman who was a teacher, and it was cold, it was the winter, she was walking down the streets, and she was getting too cold, and so she knocked on the door of the British embassy in whatever town, maybe in Bucharest, I forget what town. Knocked on the door of the British embassy and said, could I just warm up for a minute? I'm on my way home. And during this time, under communism, there was very little food because they couldn't get, it didn't work. Communism doesn't work. And so everybody's eating potatoes and soup basically for every meal. And she steps in, and the British ambassadors or whoever were there offered her some oranges. She remembered that distinctly. They offered me some oranges, which we didn't ever have oranges where I was, but they had oranges. And so it was winter and we had oranges. So she's eating an orange and warming herself up. And they say, "Hey, could we give you a book? You're a teacher, would you like something to read?" And so they gave her a copy of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And so she was very excited about this. And so she took it home, and she's a teacher, and she read it, and her eyes just, whoa. She said, "This is Romania. It's this really cold place where there's this evil witch who has a secret police that will come and snatch you away and take you away, and you'll never be heard from again. And yet there's this lion who comes in and saves the day and overturns the witch. And this book is writing about Romania." And so she got really excited. And so she said, "I need to translate this book into Romanian." And so she set out to translate The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe into Romanian. And this was obviously 30 some odd years ago. And so from that, then it's kind of grown to where now there are a number of Christian scholars and other scholars who are sort of digging into the writings of C.S. Lewis and others like Tolkien and Dorothy Sayers and George MacDonald in Romania, all because a British ambassador gave a copy of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe to a poor teacher on her way home in the cold. So that's kind of a fun story. But so back to the White Witch. White Witch is potent, and we need to think carefully about why she's evil and what Lewis is trying to show us about the nature of evil. Okay, and there's sort of two sides to her character. There's layers here. So on the one hand, you've got the always winter, never Christmas dynamic, and that's not merely about the fact that it's cold. Like I live in Minnesota, and the cold can actually be kind of enjoyable, right? Snow's fun. We go sledding. We go ice skating up here. We have a big time in the snow. My boys all through the winter at school build snow forts and stuff at school and have big snowball fights, and it's a blast. So snow can be fun. So it's not the winter part that's the problem. Lewis had an appreciation for winter, and it's part of the yearly cycle of the seasons. The problem is the always winter, never Christmas. And the idea there, right, is that the witch, as an evil witch, is hostile to what in the book calls jollification or joviality or celebration. Okay. And so it's winter, but without the joy and the gladness and the celebration of a warm hearth and a fire and hot drinks and big feasts. That's what she's hostile toward. And so it's the always winter, never Christmas. It's that hostility to celebration and to joy and to life that is the mark of the witch's evil. That's how you know she's evil. But you also notice something else there, right? So part of it's about the weather, part of it's about the hostility to the celebration, but in particular, it actually centers on food. And so if you think about the witch in the story, there's sort of two ways that she approaches food. On the one hand, you've got the key scene, right, when she's on her sledge and with Edmund, and they're riding through, and they come across the little party after Father Christmas has shown up, and Father Christmas has laid this feast, right? It's now Christmas, and so you can have this great feast. And she says, "What is the meaning of this? And this waste and this self-indulgence?" Okay, so the witch looks at a holiday feast, and she says, "This is self-indulgent. This is bad. This is wasteful. You shouldn't do this. Instead, you should eat moldy bread and water," which is what she'd given to Edmund earlier in that chapter. And so on the one side, there's this sort of hostility to good gifts and good food that the witch embodies. She hates self-indulgence. This is the danger of a false asceticism, right? That says, don't enjoy your food, don't eat and drink to the glory of God. Instead, make sure you thin it out and only drink bread and water. Now, of course, the other side of that happens earlier in the story with Edmund as well, when they first meet, and she offers him a warm cup to drink. And she's trying to deceive him, and she gives him a warm cup, and he drinks it, and it warms him down to his toes. And then she says, it's not good to just drink and not eat something. What would you like best? Turkish delight, Your Majesty. And then she pours out her magic, and he gets this big box of Turkish delight, which I don't know how many of you have had Turkish delight. It's gross. Okay. Like, it is not good. Anybody who tells you it's good is lying to you. And in fact, I think the fact that Edmund asks for that is part of how we're supposed to know that he's a bad character, because of all the, if a witch says, "Hey, I'll give you any food that you want," like, pick a good one, for goodness sake. But Edmund picks this horrible one, Turkish delight, and then gobbles it up. And of course, then we're told by the narrator that Edmund didn't know this, but the witch did, that this was enchanted Turkish delight. And anybody who tasted it would want to go on eating, and would eat and eat and eat and eat until they eventually killed themselves. They would become obsessed. And in fact, that's precisely what we see with Edmund, is that obsession with Turkish delight becomes the only thing he thinks about. And it's part of why he's willing to sort of sell his siblings down the river and turn them over to the White Witch. And it's part of what puts him on her side. He's eaten her food. The beaver says that later in the story. I looked in his eyes. I could tell he'd been with the witch and eaten her food. And so notice that's the kind of the flip side of the food danger, right? So one side is the good food is self-indulgent and wasteful, and you should only eat moldy bread and water. And the other side is this kind of like overindulgence and gluttony that says eat and eat and eat until you kill yourself, and be willing to do anything, however wicked, in order to get more of the food. And so the witch is at both extremes. Now, contrast that with other characters in the story, right? Of course, you've got I mentioned already the little party in the woods with the fox and the squirrels and so forth. And then you've got the big feast at the end at Cair Paravel, where Aslan provided them food, though nobody knew how, and the wine flowed and everybody drank, and it was this great party, great feast at the castle. And that's wonderful. But actually, one of the best scenes in the movie, one that makes me hungry all the time, is the scene in the beaver's house, where they're sitting down and they're having some good trout that freshly caught. The beaver just caught him in his little ice hole. I actually know what that is. I've seen that up here in Minnesota. I'm not originally from here. I'm from Texas, but there's a hole, and you can spear a fish if you've got a spear, or you can fish with a fishing pole. And the beaver catches the fish, and they cook them up quickly, and they have some sticky marmalade rolls and some boiled potatoes, and it's just kind of this simple, basic kind of meat and potatoes, fish and potatoes meal, but it's just glorious, right? And they're sitting around and they're laughing and they're talking, and Aslan's on the move, and there's hope again, because he's going to break the witch's magic, and maybe these kids are going to sit on the thrones of Cair Paravel. And so we're going to tell the old stories and look forward to the future hope, and we're going to share this meal, and it's just glorious. Okay. And that picture of fellowship over a meal is meant to shape us. It's meant to help us think about what I'm sitting at my dinner table right now. What is this dinner table supposed to be? When my wife cooks up taco salad, or when she cooks up pumpkin crunch cake, or whatever she makes for dinner, big soup here in the winter, chili. We want to have that, and we want to eat our bread and drink our wine with merry hearts, because God has approved us, because God's on our side, because the stories are true and the hope is real. And we want to have laughter and joy and old stories and new stories told, because that's the picture that that's what the gospel does. The gospel creates that kind of fellowship, whereas anti-gospel is don't eat that kind of food, don't share that kind of meal because it's wasteful and self-indulgent, or gorge yourself, only think about yourself, be willing to do anything for the food and ignore the people. In fact, get rid of the people because they're just getting in the way of you getting more for yourself. And so there's sort of the witch shows us the contrast, and then the book also shapes us in terms of how we should think about our own meal times. That's one big one. I'm going to give you one more, and then we'll open it up for some questions. This is, I think, probably, there's a lot we could talk about. Maybe you guys can ask about deep magic and deeper magic. That's kind of a fun one. But actually, the thing that is always the most powerful to me about this chronicle is the character arc of Edmund. Okay. Of course, Lucy is, of course, throughout the stories, the most sensitive to Aslan, the one who understands him the best, the one who follows him most faithfully. But Edmund's story in this book is really, really profound. And the way that I put it in my book, summarized it, is that the story of Edmund shows us that we are always sowing the seeds of our future selves. Okay, let me say that again. We're always sowing the seeds of our future selves. And what I mean by that is, I'm sure that anybody who's ever read Narnia has always, kind of wished, man, if only I could get in there. If only when I open my closet, if only when I open my wardrobe. I don't have a wardrobe. Do you have wardrobes? I don't know anybody who has a wardrobe. But if I opened my closet and ended up in a magic world, how cool would that be? Okay. And of course, Lewis has the little detail, this another little fun detail, right? The number of times in the story where they go into the wardrobe and begin to close the door. And you'll notice the good characters like Lucy and Peter always remember, don't shut the door after you when you go into a wardrobe. It's a very foolish thing to do that. You might lock yourself in. Whereas Edmund is an idiot and he goes in there and shuts it behind him, and because he's dumb. But Lewis says it over and over and over again. And the reason he does that is that when he was writing the book, he sent them to his friends, Owen and Maud Barfield. And their adopted daughter, Lucy, was the one who it's dedicated to. Lucy Barfield, is the book's dedicated to her. And so he sent them the books and said, hey, would you read these? Tell me if you think they're any good. And apparently Maud wrote back and said, we think they're great, but you have this whole wardrobe thing. And you know that if you tell kids that there might be a magic world inside their wardrobe, they're going to go in there and they're going to lock themselves in. And so, you better do some safety training here, Lewis. And so every time he mentions the wardrobe, he's got to make sure he mentions, and it's a very foolish thing to shut yourself in a wardrobe. Don't ever shut yourself in a wardrobe. Don't be like Edmund. Edmund's dumb and foolish and beastly. Don't be like the bad character. Be like the wise, good character, Lucy and Peter. Okay, back to Edmund. So Edmund, though, so we always ask, man, wouldn't it be great to get into Narnia? Edmund shows us maybe not, right? We always think, man, if we got into Narnia, wouldn't it be great? Wouldn't it be great to meet a faun? It would be. But what if you met a witch? What if you came through the wardrobe and the first person you encounter is not a faun who becomes your best friend, and is not a beaver, and is not a robin who's going to lead you to Aslan or whatever? What if instead you meet the white witch and she says, come up on my sledge and eat my food? And you say, well, that seems kind of unfair, right? Like it seems unfair that Edmund got put in that position. But if we're actually paying attention, Lewis is teaching us something about the way God governs the world. We know that you have to think about how Edmund is introduced from the very first chapters. Okay, from the very first, he's whining and fussing. He's saying things like, stop trying to talk like mother. Sort of talking to his to Susan, who's telling him to go to bed. Who do you say when I'm go to bed? Go to bed yourself. He's really rude, and kind of mocks people. He's grumbling. He's complaining, and then. When Lucy comes back out of the wardrobe and is telling him, hey, everybody, I found a secret room inside the wardrobe. He's like, she's batty, she's crazy. And then Edmund, it says, could be spiteful. And on this occasion, he was spiteful. He sneered and jeered at Lucy, kept on asking her if she found any other new countries in her other cupboards all over the house. So he makes fun of her, pokes at her. And then when they're playing hide and seek and she jumps in the wardrobe again and he sees her, he's going to follow her in there because he wanted to go on teasing her. That's why, that's the reason he wanted to do it. And of course, that's when he shuts the door behind him, which is a very foolish thing to do. And then when he gets in there, he's not apologetic, right? really. He says, Lucy, I'm here. And he doesn't want to admit that he's wrong. He says, come on, come out, make it Pax, let's make peace. And no answer because she's off finding the fawn. Just like a girl, said Edmund to himself, sulking somewhere and won't accept an apology. And it's like, well, you didn't give an apology. You weren't sorry at all. You're trying to make excuses. You're trying to get through it. You're not sorry that you made fun of her at all. You're just trying to save face. And then, of course, he meets the witch, eats her food, and comes back through. And then this is one of the key moments, right? I'm back on this side of the door, in chapter 5, where Lucy's so excited. Edmund's been in there. He can vouch for it. He'll say there really is a magic country inside the wardrobe. And Peter, Susan, it's all true. Edmund's been there. And then Peter says, well, Ed, what's it all about? And then Lewis's line, I think, is really important. And now we come to one of the nastiest things in the story. Up to that moment, Edmund had been feeling sick and sulky and annoyed with Lucy for being right, but he hadn't made up his mind what to do. When Peter suddenly asked him the question, he decided all at once to do the meanest and most spiteful thing he could think of. He decided to let Lucy down. And this is a really important moment in the story, because what he just did there is he made a deliberate, willful, and conscious choice to be a punk, to be mean and spiteful and beastly. And of course, he says, it's all made up. I was just playing. We were just messing around. Lucy starts crying, runs away. And then Peter rounds on him, says, you're always being beastly to anyone smaller than yourself. That's important. That tells us a little bit about his character, his backstory, right? Smaller kids, he's always picking on them. That's what he does at school. He picks on kids. And so Edmund's character before he gets in is this nasty, beastly, spiteful, mean-spirited kid. And so when he gets in the wardrobe, who does he meet? The White Witch, right? And then once he's in there and he's on her side, then we see his character develop from there, right? So when they meet the beaver, and Aslan's on the move, he has this horrible feeling inside, right? When he encounters goodness and beauty in the character of Aslan, he's like, oh no. And this is something that actually shows up a number of places in Lewis's writings. The notion that goodness is always itself. Goodness is always good. But we ought not think that because goodness is good, it would be good if we encountered it, because we're not good, right? And there's a number of places, one of them is in Paralandra, where he talks about, sort of this idea that I'd always wanted to meet goodness, but now that I actually met it, I didn't want it at all. And oh no, who's gonna, if a bad thing is chasing you, you can always hold out hope that the good will come and rescue you. But what if you meet the goodness and you find it impossible to stay? Who's gonna rescue you from the good thing, right? Who's gonna rescue you from the good? And so there's this element of how do we respond to the good? What kind of people are we? So that if we meet good things, if we meet God, if we meet Aslan, how are we going to respond to him? Is it going to be with this leaning in, brave, adventurous, exciting, it's holidays, it's summer, or is it horror? I want to get out of here. I don't want to be around that guy at all. Which then, of course, Edmund, his story continues, right? He's walking through the woods in the forest, and it's cold. He's getting bitter, and this just makes him angry. And instead of it, so it's just cold. It's just wet. It's his own fault for running around, for leaving the party like he did. But instead of being upset at the weather, he's mad at Peter, right? He's like, Aslan's awful. I'm on the queen's side. And it says even though he knew that the White Witch was bad and cruel, he was still clinging to her because he wanted more Turkish delight, and he hated his brother. He was imagining all of the things he would do to Peter once the witch makes him into a king, and he's going to put Peter in his place. And every time the snow falls him, all he can think about is how much he hates Peter, just as if it had all been Peter's fault, right? And this and part of this that Lewis is trying to show us is this is a trajectory, right? Edmund was sowing those seeds way back when he was picking on kids at school. And then those seeds started to grow so that when it came time for when Lucy finds her magic world, he makes fun of her. And then when Lucy's turns out to be right, rather than make peace about it, he doesn't even want to apologize. And in fact, he's going to double down and actively choose with his will to lean into the evil, to lean into the cruelty, to lean into the meanness and the nastiness, and go there. And then because of that, he's wrapped up with the right witch. He gets ensnared and enslaved and follows her, and he just sinks deeper and deeper and deeper to the point that he's in her palace saying, my brother and sister are down there with the beavers. And then she's like, wolves, go kill them. Right? That's how bad. How did, if you're Edmund, you're kind of like, how did I end up here? And the answer is little bitty choices, right? Little bitty choices. Lewis says this in Mere Christianity. He said, I would rather say that every time you make a choice, you are turning the central part of you, the part of you that chooses, into something a little different than it was before. And taking your life as a whole, with all of your innumerable choices, all your life long, you are slowly turning this central thing, this choosing thing, either into a heavenly creature or into a hellish creature. Either into a creature that is in harmony with God, Aslan, and with other creatures, your siblings, and with itself, or else into one that is in a state of war and hatred with God and with fellow creatures and with itself. What they are always thinking of is the mark which the action leaves on the central self, which no one sees in this life, but which each one of us will have to endure or enjoy forever. And so this is a major theme in Lewis's writings, is about the way that our small choices, the little seeds that we sow, blossom into the people that we will be. And of course, Edmund's story takes him all the way, not just to the White Witch's house, but eventually, to being slapped by her and then tied to a tree and about to be, sacrificed with a stone knife in order to prevent the prophecy from coming true. Now, that's where the story might have ended, right? Thankfully, Edmund doesn't live in a story where that's the only possibility. He lives in a story of grace, and he's rescued by Aslan. And even more than that, Aslan sacrifices himself on Edmund. So Edmund sowed these seeds, and then Aslan bore the fruit, right? Edmund didn't bear the brunt. He didn't reap the whirlwind. Aslan reaped the whirlwind on Edmund's behalf. This is the beauty of sacrifice. This is stealing past the watchful dragons to show us the beauty of sacrificial love, of atonement, of substitution in this story, so that Edmund's story is one of grace and mercy triumphing over judgment, and not one of him reaping what he had sown throughout his life. All right. Those are a couple of lessons. We got a number of different places that we could go. I've got all kinds of other things that I could say, but maybe let's get some questions from you guys.
Well, thanks. I'm taking notes. I appreciate all of that. You've covered a lot of ground, and there's probably so much that you haven't left or haven't touched, because you can explore the wardrobe over and over again. Let me start out with a question. There's one that I chatted as I wrote down as you were chatting, and I was thinking, since you've read this so many times now, and this is a character question, and the first one will be an easy one, but let me ask them both. Who's your favorite character? And then what was probably to you the most surprising character you found in Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe? So once you start reading some of these kinds of genre, some of these characters become kind of tropish over time. Okay, you've got your witch character, obviously an Aslan character, but did anyone surprise you?
Yeah, it's hard to remember from the first time I read it. So in terms of this book in particular, so if we're limiting ourselves to just Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe.
Yes, just Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe.
Character that surprised me, and a favorite character. So Edmund's my favorite character. I like his arc. I resonate with it. I've been the guy who's just stewing in what people have done to me, even when it wasn't their fault. Although it's interesting. Yes, maybe this would actually be a surprising moment. When you watch the interaction, I've got two boys, an 11-year-old and a 9-year-old. I've got two brothers myself. And so I get brother relations. I don't have sisters. So that's always a little bit like of a mystery to me in terms of how brothers and sisters growing up relate, because I didn't have one. But I have brothers. And so and I'm the oldest. So watching the Peter Edmund relationship now is kind of an interesting one. And so I like Edmund's arc because of the power of grace. I've been the guy who's like, I cannot believe I'm just angry at the world and it's not their fault, but I'm going to pretend like it's their fault and I'm going to make it their fault. And that sort of doubling down and choosing to do evil, and yet then the grace coming in and rescuing. So I'd say that's probably my favorite arc in the story. The surprising thing though is, even though Edmund's beastly, he's a punk, and all of this sort of stuff, Peter does get angry at him, right? So there's a really important part in the book where Edmund's trying to ask a question, and Peter basically says, "Shut up, you! No one's talking to you," or something like that. Like there's this moment he says, "Shut up," after he's angry because Edmund has lied about being in the wardrobe before, and Peter's feeling protective of Lucy. Like, you made Lucy out to be a fool and an idiot, and yet you had been here. You're such a liar, and he's angry. And that's one of the things, though, that like drives Edmund away. So that's why he's leaving, and that's why he's so mad at Peter. So that later, when they come and present themselves before Aslan, and they say, "We've come, Aslan," and he's like, "Greetings, Peter. Greetings, Susan. Greeting, Lucy. Where's the fourth?" And the beaver says he's gone off to the White Witch. He's on her side. And then Peter jumps in and says, "Part of that's my fault." Right? Like I helped drive him away. Like I did not help this situation. Yes, Edmund made his own choices and he was a punk, but I did not make it. I made it easy for him to be angry and bitter and to leave. And so there's kind of a surprising moment, it's part of what shows, I think, Peter's character as a nobleness there, a nobility in being willing to accept responsibility for himself, right? He's not saying all of it's my fault. That's not what he says, because that wouldn't be true. That'd be lying. And like Lucy's not willing to lie, even though they're like, "You didn't really get into a wardrobe. Look, knock, knock, it's not there." And she's a very truthful girl. And she's like, "No, I was there. I'm not going to lie." And Peter's not going to lie and say it was all my fault. But some of it was my fault. There was a part of that I need to own and I need to confess. And so here's my opportunity. Some of that's my fault. And so that's a surprising moment that I think I really appreciate about Peter's character.
That's good. I'm an older brother too, so I'm familiar with those conflicts.
That's right.
All right, let's go to the questions. We have an anonymous attendee, and they asked what can I do if I don't enjoy the Narnian books as much as I did in my childhood? Any tips to help someone rekindle that desire?
That's a great question. I think in some ways, you might read other things from Lewis. Because I think part of what has made my, 50th and 60th reading enriching is my familiarity with the rest of his, his essays and the Ransom trilogy and Great Divorce and these sort of things. So I think there's a number of things that I wouldn't have seen or appreciated as much if I wasn't as familiar with the fullness of his thought. And so I'd say that would be one way. I'd say it's not obligatory that you like them as an adult. I don't think that you should try to make yourself, because this is the obligation can freeze feelings. And that's just as true if you try to make yourself feel really great about Narnia when you don't. Instead, you should try to sort of forget about yourself, relieve the pressure, read them, enjoy them. And if you enjoy them as sort of like a little diversion, on a Sunday afternoon, and then you put them down and you're like, "Oh, that was fun." But that's all it was. It's like, that's okay. Maybe something else will be the thing that will, catch your eye. So I'd say, I think my kids have gone through seasons. My oldest, when he was younger, really listened to him over and over again. And now he's just like, "I've listened to him so much, Dad." But he's reading right now the Wingfeather books by Andrew Peterson. And Andrew Peterson, of course, is a big Lewis fan and has written, these the Wingfeather Saga, 4 big books that has a very, it's not Narnia, but it's in that same kind of mode. And my son's just gobbling those up and reading and rereading. And so I'm like, if Narnia is not doing it for him, this is good too. And there's other books like that. And so feel free to. It doesn't have to be Narnia. The magic can come through many ways.
Yeah, I think it's a great observation. And one of the great things about Lewis is he's so coherent throughout his writings that over time I have forgotten where he's written certain things. I can quote by memory what he said, and then I can't remember where he said it because he probably said it the same way, it's slightly different in several resources. So reading maybe Screwtape Letters or Mere Christianity might even help you come back to it with a little bit better understanding.
Yeah, I think there's a line from Barfield. I think I've got it right in here somewhere. What Lewis thought about everything was secretly present in what he wrote about anything. That's a Barfield quote about Lewis. So what he thought about everything was present in what he wrote about anything. So you can kind of get from anything in Lewis, you can get to anywhere else in Lewis in a few quick jumps.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so Stefan asks, much has been said about Lewis's influence on modern evangelicals. What do you think modern evangelicals get right about Lewis, and what do they get wrong concerning his writings?
That's a good question.
Sounds like I think something you've also addressed in your Lewis on the Christian Life book.
Yeah. So the other book, right? I've got that one right there, Lewis on the Christian Life. KJ mentioned that. So that's basically, I got asked to write that book because I wrote the other book. So I wrote the book on Narnia, and then Crossway approached me in their series and said, "Hey, would you want to write Lewis on the Christian Life?"
Yeah.
And at one level, they were kind of like, "Do you want to just expand the Narnia book?" And I said, "Actually, I don't. I want the Narnia book to be by itself." And so that book doesn't really deal with Narnia, maybe a couple of places, and it's all about the other stuff. And I think I don't know what in terms of what evangelicalism gets right or not. I'll tell you what I get right. So I'm an evangelical. I'll tell you what I get most from him. And it's this idea of wherever you are, God is there. He's present, and he's pursuing you. And the fundamental task of your life in 1,000 different ways is to awaken and embrace that. And maybe that sounds really simplistic. And at some level it is. But I think it's fundamental. It's simply the reality that wherever you are, God is here. If you're here and now, God is here and now. Wherever you are, he's there. He's as present to you, and he knows you intimately. Psalm 139, right? Inside and out, backwards and forwards. He knows you. And that the great task that's so hard for us, because we're so distracted by the things we can see, is to kind of come alive to God's presence. It's just hard for me to, God, are you there? I want to feel and know that you're there. And so, but it can feel like there's this barrier. And so I want to do everything I can to humble myself and forget about myself in order to bring myself to come into the presence of the ever-present God, right? He's present everywhere, but I still need to come into it by opening myself up to view this. Lewis described prayer fundamentally as kind of like an unveiling before God, who sees you, even if you don't unveil. He sees through all of it. But what makes it life is when you open yourself to it. And I think that, so for me, I'd say that's the fundamental aspect of Lewis is awakening to the fact that the living and omnipresent God who reveals himself in Jesus is here and now, and he loves me, and he's pursuing me, and he will not settle for half measures. He will have it all, or he will have none. And sort of then, what am I going to do, right? Am I going to lean in? Am I going to open myself up, or am I going to recoil and run away? That's sort of the fundamental choice we're faced with every day. That's kind of, so the subtitle of my Lewis book, the other book, is Becoming Truly Human in the Presence of God. And so I think that people pick up on that quality throughout Lewis's writings, and it's really, really profound. It's really kind of fundamental mere Christianity type stuff. And I think it's where he really shines.
Yeah, that's good. And I thought you were going to go with the standard. If you don't quote Lewis once, you're not really an evangelical.
That's right. The patron saint.
Okay. So, Bill Price asks about that whole scenario where Lucy asks, is he safe? And his observation is, in rereading this, I see Lucy's question was never really answered. What should we take from this underlying theme and desire for safety?
Yeah, this is something actually, if you read Lewis, he describes himself as very risk averse and desires safety. And he said, I want safe bets, insurance policies. That's the sort of guy he is. I'm that way. I resonate with that. And so I think he said it's something like this. There's maybe one way to put it is there's two kinds of safety. There's a sort of self-driven safety. So what do I think will be good for me? Sort of protection. In the Four Loves, Lewis describes this: if you want to be safe from being hurt, don't love anyone, because love makes you vulnerable, and you're bound to get a broken heart at some point, because the person you love doesn't love you back, or the person you love dies, and it's going to be sad. And so if you want to be safe from that, then just don't love. And he says, but when you do that, know that your heart is going to change, and it's going to shrivel up, and it's going to become a nice hard rock, and that's hell. And so that's one kind of safety. is the security that we try to create for ourselves by not taking risks. And then there's this other kind, which is a risk, right? You'll have to risk it. And so that's when the Aslan is not safe. So Aslan isn't safe in the way that we want safety. He's safe in a much better way, which may require us to die, right? So if you want the kind of safety that comes on the other side of death, then God is the safest place you can be. If you're trying to avoid death, then he's not safe, because he will demolish. He will. Lewis has that great image in Mere Christianity where he's like, sometimes we want to let God into our lives, into our house, but we're kind of like, but you can't go in that closet. That's my closet, right? Don't go into that room. That's my room. You can have your room, but you're in my house. And God's like, Jesus says, this is all mine, and I can demolish it if I want. I have all rights, and I'm not safe, and I won't stay in your little box. And so Lucy's question is sort of, so does he answer it? Yes, he does. It's, is God enough, right? Is Jesus enough? And if he's enough, then he's safe. And if he's not, if you're wanting some other kind of safety apart from him, then he's not safe at all. He will blow that baby up.
Yeah, I think that's great. If you are focusing on safety, you're going to miss it. And I think of Peter in the boat. He had to get out of the boat. His desire for safety. He was safe in the boat, and actually he wasn't. Right. I got someone in the chat asking me about this sword over here. This is actually Peter's sword. It's got on the hilt Aslan, so I should point that out. And this is actually an artist's rendering of Aslan over here behind me. The original is hanging at the Wade Center in Wheaton College, not far from me. So a little Narnia nerdia for everybody. Here's a straightforward question from Becky. She asks, why didn't the older children why were they never able to get back into Narnia? She doesn't understand why they couldn't get back in.
Yeah, it's a good question, right? So Peter and Susan get to be in there for the 2, right? So they'll come back for Prince Caspian. So if you want to follow up with that, we'll talk more about that in a month when we do Prince Caspian. And then of course, Lucy and Edmund get to come back in for a 3rd, but then they're done. And later in the stories, Eustace, I think it's in Silver Chair, is talking to Jill and says, I think they've had their turn, right? And maybe here's one way to think about it. The whole point of going to Narnia is not to live in Narnia, right? This is what Aslan says in Prince Caspian, I think, to Lucy, or maybe it's in Voyage of Dawn Treader, I can't remember. This was the whole reason you were brought into Narnia, that for knowing me a little while here, you can learn to know me better there. And so the reason they can't get back is because Aslan wants them to learn to know him in this world. Okay. So they need to, he has a different name here. It's Jesus. So Aslan wants them to know him as Jesus here, and too much time in Narnia would prevent them from knowing Jesus where God wants them, where he's planted them. Of course, in the end, they get into true Narnia in the last battle. And so everything kind of comes together in the end. But their fundamental calling is not in Narnia, even though they're always kings and queens in Narnia and they grow up. But then when they come back, it's here. And this is actually this is actually a really important point, because I didn't plan on this, but I'll do it anyway. I think the modern movies get this just absolutely wrong. Okay. I think the modern movies are atrocious in capturing the spirit of this. And in particular, I have in mind the second movie, Prince Caspian, where the directors even talk about this when they were making the movie. The sort of question of, man, how hard would it have been for Peter, having been a high king, to come back and just be a kid again? And it's like, if you think that you just don't understand Narnia. Like, the whole point was, having been a king, he now knows how to be a kid. He knows how to be noble and brave and adventurous and courageous and sacrificial. He's owned that. And in the stories themselves, that's clear as day in Prince Caspian. He's not fighting with Edmund. He's not fighting with Caspian. There's no tug of war like there is in the movies, but the movies can only imagine, like this is what just demonstrates the limited imaginations of the filmmakers, who said, well, if he was a king, it would be really hard on him not to be a king anymore. And it's like, that's because you think kingship is bossing people around. You think kingship is everybody does what you want. That's what the White Witch thinks kingship is, that everybody's my slave. That's what Miraz thinks kingship is. Everybody, I'm in charge. But true kingship is dying, right? It's sacrificing yourself. And Peter is fully capable of doing that, even as a boy in England in the 40s, or in Narnia as a king, or whatever. And so that's part of why they don't get back in, is because now they need to live out. They need to live like Narnians in the real world.
Yeah, well, let's hope Netflix gets that right when they reboot the Narnia series. And they don't.
I have such little confidence, but we'll see.
Anyways, okay. Dan asks this: in a recent reading, I noticed that Professor Kirk's discussion with Peter and Susan about Lucy had a threefold conclusion. Either Lucy was lying, she was mad, or she was telling the truth. Yeah. For the first time, I put that together with Lewis's liar, lunatic, and Lord in Mere Christianity. Do you think that was intentional?
Absolutely, 100%. So you have to remember, he did Mere Christianity, was a series of broadcast talks that he did like in the early 40s. Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe wasn't published, I don't think, until 1950. Okay, so this is after that. And so you have to think about what's the relationship. He'd formulated Liar, Lunatic, Lord for an adult audience in wartime. And then now he's writing children's books. Why do that? And I think here's the reason. He's trying to teach people how to think, how to come to conclusions, right? How to work through that problem. And so he's establishing, it's another way of training us. It's preparing the way. So if a child learns to think through either Lucy's either crazy, doesn't seem crazy, or she's a liar. She's not a liar. She must be telling the truth. That pattern of thought then will be internalized based on readings and rereadings of Narnia, so that later when they're grown up, or when they're in junior high reading Mere Christianity, or when they're adults reading Mere Christianity, they'll do this. They'll have the same aha moment and go, oh. And I'll tell you this, like in my own personal faith, I regularly, I'm reading in the Gospels right now, in the Gospel of John in my devotions, and I just sit there and I go, nobody spoke like this guy. Like, it really is, like, that argument really is potent to say, if Jesus, either you don't get to have him as the moral teacher, or as just one of many, or anything like that, because the things that he says and does are so outlandish unless they're true. And so there is kind of an all, take him or leave him. It's an all or nothing proposition, but you don't get to have, as Lewis says, you don't get to have that middle option of, he's a good moral teacher, just like Socrates. That option's not open, because nobody spoke like him. Nobody talks this way. And so I think that Lewis was spot on, and he's trying to train children and then adults who read children's books, which they should do, in how to think and how to reason. And maybe another element on this, this goes back to Edmund. You'll notice that when Edmund is walking through, when they're in Narnia the second time all together, and they're walking through, and Edmund's wanting to go find the White Witch and lead him that way. And the robin is leading them to the beaver, and he keeps going to Peter. How do we know the robin's a good robin? And Peter's like, because all the good stories I've read, robins are good birds. And it's like, is that a good argument? Like, all the good stories, robins are good birds, and that's good enough for Peter. And then Edmund's like, yeah, but how do we know? And then when they meet, how do we know which is the right side? How do we know that the witch? And so he keeps framing this as though it's an intellectual problem, like epistemology. How do we know? When really it's an allegiance problem. He's on the side of the right White Witch. That's what's driving his intellectual objections, is I want more Turkish delight. And therefore, how do I know if the beavers are good or bad? How do I know if the fawns are good or bad? How do I know if Aslan is good or bad? And yet deep down, he knows the witch is cruel and evil. But he's lying to himself and therefore lying to others. So I think that kind of training in how the mind works, how the heart and mind work together, definitely part of what Lewis is doing here.
Oh yeah, we could go into epistemological debates all night and how we come to know things and make form our opinions and desires. That's a great observation. Thanks. Stefan asks, it's such a well-known story, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, but what are some of the subtle themes or ideas that are most often missed, do you think?
I'd say that the food thing, I don't see that one captured as much that I mentioned. That's why I dwelt on that. I think the connection, maybe this is obvious to people, but deep magic and deeper magic. Deep magic is the moral law, and deeper magic is sacrificial love. And so if you read the stories and you just substitute what's deep magic, that's what the witch appeals to and says, if someone's guilty, they belong to me. That's like, if you sin, it should be punished. That's what goodness demands, is that you be punished. This is the moral law. And then Lewis is saying, but there's a deeper magic than that, which is the law of sacrificial love. And that goes back before the dawn of time, because that's rooted in the very nature of God. And so I think that there's some really rich, deep themes about what magic is. Another theme. There's an interesting line that always strikes me. Towards the end of the book, I think it's when they're at Cair Paravel, and they say they're having the feast, and it goes something like this. It says they're sleeping out. Aslan provided food. They began marching to the castle of Cair Paravel on this little hill, and before them were the sands of the beach with rocks and little pools of salt water and seaweed and the smell of the sea and long miles of bluish green waves breaking forever and ever on the beach. And oh, the cry of the seagulls, have you heard it? Can you remember? And it's just a really interesting line. There's a way in which Lewis he's remembering something. In fact, I think, you guys mentioned your Ireland tours, right? So I've been to Ireland and had a good friend there show me around, sort of the origin of Narnia, which, is sort of Lewis's childhood home there in Ireland, Northern Ireland. But the sea and the waves lapping the shore, this is like Lewis's childhood memory, and he's capturing it, and he's sort of like inviting you in and saying, have you heard it? Can you remember? And you're like, well, what if you've never been to Ireland? But he's like, yeah, but can you still remember it? And so that he's trying to drawing us into this sense of longing and ache, the longing for joy that he talks about in his autobiography. And so I think that's a real subtle thing that people may miss in reading through the stories.
Okay, here's a slightly controversial one. A secular friend once told me he didn't like to read Lewis because he was anti-woman. Do you think Lewis's portrayal of Lucy and Susie, particularly Lucy, says otherwise?
Yeah, I don't think he's anti-woman, but I do think he's anti-egalitarian. Okay, so what I mean by that is he does not think men and women are interchangeable units, but that they have their own distinctive glories, which we ought to celebrate. And so if you notice in the stories, like the character of Lucy throughout the stories, she's clearly the one who's most in tune with Aslan. She's wise. She's thoughtful. Susan has her flaws, right? So she's a little more cowardly, right? She's always a little bit risk averse. And so Lewis shows that, but she's also Queen Susan the Gentle. We see some nobility in her at various different times as well. But you'll notice, like, one of the key scenes, and this is actually one that they edit out in the movies. They change this one. When Father Christmas gives them their weapons. And Lewis I think this is a big deal, because he says there's differences between men and women. And he gives, on the one hand, he gives Peter the sword, and he says, here's in the shield, you're gonna need that. He gives Susan the horn and the bow, and he gives Lucy the cordial of healing and a knife, a dagger. But he says to the two girls, only use your weapons as a last resort, right? Sort of back against the wall, you can use your weapons. I don't intend for you to fight in the battle. And then Lucy pipes up and she says, why not? I think I could be brave enough. And Father Christmas says, that's probably true. You're brave. So he's acknowledging Lucy is brave, but he says battles are ugly when women fight. And I think Lewis really believes this. I believe this. I think that God built men for certain kinds of activities, and he built women for different ones. And Lewis wanted us to celebrate the distinctive glories of men and women, men as protectors, as those willing to fight and lay down their lives in that way, and then women as nurturers, as those who care, as those who give life. And he intends for us to see that as a glorious thing, that God built us in different ways, not as men are better than women, or women are better than men. Chesterton has this great line that I love, where it's a little poem. He says, if I put the sun beside the moon, and if I put the land beside the sea, and if I put the country beside the city, I suppose some fool will ask which one's better. And he's talking about manhood, womanhood. If you put the man beside the woman, I suppose some fool will ask which one's better. Because it's not because suns and moons are interchangeable. Suns and moons are different. The land and the sea are different. Mountains are different than the beach. Men and women are different, but better is not the right word for it. So no, I don't think that Lewis was anti-woman, but I do think he loved the distinctive glory. I've actually got a chapter in the book called The Glory of the Narnian Queen. And I sort of walk through Lucy and Susan, and then some of the later characters and later in the books, Polly and Jill, and just all of the richness that they bring to the story as Lewis tries to portray the beauty of godly femininity.
Great. Okay, I think we're going to be able, we've got probably more questions. We have time. I think we can hit up 3 or 4 more. And this one, you feel free to take a pass on this if you're not familiar with it. But Patience asks, in Neil Gaiman's criticism, The Problem of Susan, he retells Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe to interact with Susan's rejection of Narnia. Do you think there are seeds of Susan's falling away in Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe and in Caspian that the reader can look back on in retrospect when reading The Last Battle and say, oh, that makes sense? Or is it just a surprising twist that shows up in the last book?
Yeah, I don't think the seeds there. I think we do see Susan's temptations in her tendency to avoid risk and her timidity, right? So if you do track her in the early books, she does have that tendency to kind of shrink back. So when the fawn's been taken by the White Witch, she's like, we need to go home. And then Lucy's like, we can't go home. This is my fault. And then Susan kind of comes along with it. And then she's the last one to see, I think she's the last one to see Aslan in Prince Caspian. So we'll revisit that one later. But in The Last Battle, the reason that she is unable to, she doesn't get into Narnia then, is because she wants to be grown up. So it doesn't have anything to do with the timidity or the fear dimension that she kind of has earlier. It has far more to do, her desire for, all she cares about is nylons and boys. I forget there's 2 or 3 things that Polly mentions that she's always caring about. And it's basically the desire that basically adolescents have. So not children, but sort of that junior high age, to be very grown up and to want to appear very grown up. And Lewis actually writes about this in a number of places. And he says, the desire to be very grown up is one of the most childish things that we do, right? Grown-ups, so like it's only when you're trying to grow up that you really care. I want to be grown up. Once you're a grown up, you actually sometimes want to be a kid, right? Eat ice cream all the time. And you can, that's actually legal. Unlike my parents. All the time. Like there's no holding back. But so it's that desire to be grown up is what hinders her from sort of being a part of the Narnians anymore. No longer a friend of Narnia. And so I don't think it has anything to do with the fact that she's a girl. It's just the form that her desire for being grown up involves girl things. But it's that it could have very easily been a masculine version of that, of wanting to be grown up, and that's kid stuff. And you see that actually with sort of Eustace kind of embodies that a little bit sometimes. I think we see that a little bit in Diggory as well, just kind of like that, like puffing up your chest. And I'm not a kid, that sort of dimension. And it's just, Susan has that. She's a teenager and she wants to be grown up. And so she cares about makeup and nylons. And so I don't think it's anti-feminine. And I don't think that it's necessarily the same sorts of temptations as we see in the first couple books.
Okay. We've got a couple more biblically themed questions here that I'd like to get to. One is, do you think having Aslan's camp with the pavilion at first and later the castle at Cair Paravel is like Israel first having the tabernacle and then later the temple?
I doubt that Lewis intended that. I do think he sets up Narnia. This is relevant for how people tend to, deal with the problem of Emeth, the color marine soldier who gets into heaven, gets into true Narnia, despite the fact that he's a worshiper of Tash. One of the important elements is that Narnia is not set up. So there's connections between the Narnian supposal and Christianity, but Narnia itself is set up more like the Old Testament than it is like the New Testament. Okay. So you have the kingdom of Narnia, which is like Israel, that worships the true God, that follows the true king. And then you have these sort of kingdoms around Israel, around Narnia, which are also can be faithful. So like Archenland is the prime example. And I would say that's kind of like Tyre under King Hiram. If you remember, King Hiram is the one in the Book of Kings who helps Solomon build the temple. And then beyond that, you've got the big empire, right? You've got Calormene, which is an empire like Babylon or something like that. And so I think that there are some resonances and similarities there between the way that the Narnian map is laid out relative to the Old Testament. And so there's no Narnian Great Commission. I talk about this in the book in Dealing with Emmett. Like there's no command from Aslan to the Narnians, go forth into all the world and spread the gospel of Aslan. Instead, it's you guys be faithful, live like Narnians, be faithful to me, which is much more of an Old Testament-y kind of way of looking at it. But I don't know that I would make the connection between this stone table and then Cair Paravel, because Cair Paravel is not a temple, it's a castle. And so it's not a center of worship in the same way that the temple would have been.
Okay. That's a great observation. I never thought about that being more Old Testament. Another one along those lines a little bit is, as a trainer of pastors, do you think the Chronicles have a place in the pulpit, say referencing them in a sermon or in discipleship or counseling session? Well, I mean, I think part of it is your book here gives it away, but I'd like you to answer that a little more pointedly.
Yeah, I do, but I think only in certain contexts. So like, there's ways in which in certain places, where that, so I'm a pastor, if I know that a lot of my people have read Narnia, love Narnia, it's perfectly appropriate for me to make the allusion. So when I preached Psalm 139 there and was doing some Lewis elements. And so I talked about Jesus and I said, he's not safe, but he's good. And knowing that even that many people would get the allusion, and some people wouldn't, and that was okay. And so I think things like that are appropriate, or using illustrations are appropriate. I think you have to be careful though, because not everybody has, and we shouldn't assume, and therefore there's ways. I mean, I've actually had some conversations with this about multi-ethnic contexts where so I've had conversations with Black brothers and sisters who'd be like, our folks haven't read Narnia. That's not kind of like it's not like every kid grows up reading Narnia in the Black church. And so if you come into a Black church and you start quoting Narnia, people aren't going to get it unless you really explain the scene. And I don't know how true that is universally or whatever, but I think there is an element of like, you have to know some context to know what, and same thing with Lord of the Rings, or any other kind of allusion, that people who haven't read it might feel like we're on the outside, you guys are the insiders. And of course, that's not what you want to do in a sermon. And so when I do it, I tend to try to either really explain what I'm trying to do so that I can bring everybody along with me, or I try to make it so subtle that only a few people will get it, and those that don't will still get the point, like he's not safe but good. Even if nobody's ever heard of Narnia, they can get the substance of that point. Okay,
we'll go with a couple more here, and then we'll call it a night and look forward to it next time. Isaac asks this: I noticed that Lewis's narrative style changed between Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe and Caspian. Originally, I thought it was due to him finding his voice as a fictional author, but I've noticed that in Pilgrim's Regress, his style is closer to the later Chronicles, in my opinion. So do you have any insight as to Lewis may have changed gears for Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, or do you think he even did?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure that I've picked up, obviously you've got the clear change in diction in the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the way that the kids start talking like they're in a Chaucer story or Fairy Queen at the end when they grow up and start talking these and thous and forthwiths and all that kind of stuff before they come back through. And that's certainly intentional. He is trying to kind of conjure. There's been some good scholarly work done on sort of the Renaissance background of that kind of speech, Spencer and that sort of thing. I don't know that I've noticed a strong enough difference between early Chronicles and late Chronicles to be able to speak to it. And then I do know that in reading through his letters, so I really love reading the letters of Lewis. They've got this big, I've got them on my computer, so I don't have to have big ones, but they've got them on Kindle, they've got them on different software, and you can just read his correspondence, which is just fascinating. And it's very interesting about how quickly, like he's writing these books, and it's just like boom, 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 boom. Because you see it in the letters, he's just mentioning, I just finished the second one, I just finished the third one, and you're like, man, he was just churning these things out. And so some of that may simply be like what mood he was in when he was writing. I do think that you can detect, I detect more correspondences between some of his other books, like Great Divorce and say Four Loves, or the Ransom trilogy and a number of his essays. I can find all kinds of correspondences Paralandra and Preface to Paradise Lost. If you read those in tandem, man, you'll see that he was working on those at the same time. So there's a number of things like that. But when it comes to Chronicles, I don't detect enough of a strong enough difference to really know.
Okay. And finally, there's so much chatter going on in the chat room and things like that about allegory. I wonder if you might say a thing about the that cloud of allegory, and maybe even his debate with Tolkien, who abhorred allegory. And whether this is true allegory, and if it's any more or any less allegory than maybe even Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, so this is a place where the letters are helpful. He says quite explicitly, this is not allegory. And the difference when he's explaining it is, an allegory is taking something immaterial or invisible and giving it a material form so that we can understand it better. So Pilgrim's Progress is the classic example that he points to. And he says, despair is a feeling that we have, right? Like a feeling of depression, of hopelessness. And that feeling is represented in Pilgrim's Progress as a giant, which attacks you and throws you into a prison and locks you in a cage and threatens to eat you up. And so that's taking an immaterial feeling and giving it a physical form. That's not what he's doing in Narnia. Instead, he calls what he's doing a supposal. And the idea is, he says, suppose there was a world like Narnia with talking beasts and so forth, and suppose that the Son of God became incarnate in that world, just like he really did become incarnate in this world. What would that be like? And let's sort of tease that out. And so it's much more like of a parallel. This is actually how he kind of depicts it. It's like, it's a parallel thing, not simply an extended metaphor or allegorical picture of an invisible thing. It's actually another physical picture of a really physical thing. Like Jesus really did become a man in this world, and Aslan really does become a beast in that world. And so it's not right to think of these allegories. I think Tolkien's criticism actually, is much more along the lines of, he didn't like the hodgepodge. He didn't like that Lewis threw together, these 4 kids, which if you want to find out some of the sources of this stuff, go read some Snow Queen by Hans Christian Andersen, and you'll see The White Witch. Go read, which also inspired Frozen, I think.
Yeah.
And then you've got these 4 kids, 4 siblings. And so go read 5 Children in It by Edith Nesbit and the Samiad trilogy, and you'll find the kids. And then you got Father Christmas thrown in there, and then you got the fawns and the satyrs, and you got the lion. And then, of course, if you work through the rest of Chronicles, you get Bacchus and Silenus and, sort of Greek mythology, naiads and dryads, all this sort of stuff. And Tolkien's just like, there's no coherence here. But of course, Tolkien's the sort of guy that's like, if he gives you a character, that guy's got to have a genealogy going back to his great grandparents, and they need to have a language. And so Tolkien's like level of in-depth and intricacy is just of a different order. On that note, for those that might be interested, one of the best books on Narnia that I've read are the 2 books by Michael Ward. His big book's called Planet Narnia, which is excellent. And then there's a smaller, more accessible version called the Narnia Code. And those books are really, I didn't talk about any of the stuff that Ward points out in these books in this talk. But there are layers and depths to what Lewis is doing in terms of his love of the medieval worldview and the medieval cosmos and all this kind of stuff that he's like weaving in really profound ways. And Ward's book is just an excellent way. So maybe actually that would be my answer to the person who asked, what if I don't love Narnia as much as an adult? I'd say go read Ward's stuff about what Narnia, the depths in it, and then go read Narnia again and see if that doesn't awaken you again to like layers and depths that might stoke the fire again.
And that's a good observation about Tolkien. If he had written Narnia, he probably would have had a Narnian language, and we'd have societies learning Narnian and keeping it alive, speaking Klingon and Narnian.
That's right.
Okay, well, this was really great. I really feel like we could have gone another 30, 40 minutes, but I want to honor folks' time and not wear them out in the first session, or you as well. Any tips or maybe advice before we come back? Next session, we're going to be going on Prince Caspian, and I'm going to pull up the slide here in a minute so everybody's got the dates again. But any homework other than go back and reread it?
Yeah, I'd say reread it. I'll do something similar to what I did tonight, and pick up a couple high points that I've written about, and maybe some new things if I did when I'm gonna reread it along with, it's a book club, right? So I'm gonna reread or re-listen probably between now and February to the book, and if I pick up any new nuggets, I may bring those in. So I'd say read the books, enjoy them, jot down those notes, things you might notice, and then we'll have a big time in a month.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that tonight, Joe. And I'm going to very quickly throw the slides up here. Folks, you can see February 25th, 7:30 Eastern, 6:30 Central. We'll be, Joe will be rejoining us for Prince Caspian. And then March 18th, Voyage of the Dawn Treader. So mark your calendars, please, and join us then if you can. And then let me just make a quick pitch. All the cities that we have a C.S. Lewis Institute in, we're going to start taking applications for our C.S. Lewis Fellows program. We read a ton of Lewis in these programs, as well as a lot of other Christian classics like Dietrich Bonhoeffer and things like that. It's a tuition-free program. It's a great way to live out the sorts of things we're talking about here. It's great to be an expert in Narnia. It's great to be an expert on mere Christianity, but these are all for a purpose, to live out Christ, go deeper in who we are in Christ, and understand who we are in Christ in this world, and share that with others. So if you're interested, there's the link. We'd love to have you join us. Beyond that, Joe, would you mind closing us with a quick word of prayer?
I'd be very happy to. Lord, we thank you for, we want to give thanks for the teachers you've given to the church. You give them so that we can be equipped for the work of ministry and be edified. And Lewis was a great teacher, and he taught in so many ways and has been influential. So we just want to thank you for his influence. Remember him in prayer, remember his influence, and celebrate that. And we pray that you would use him and his writings, even these Narnian Chronicles, to help us to live like Narnians, to live like faithful Christians, following the Lion of Judah, your son, Jesus. And so thank you for Christ. Help us to love him more, in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. And thanks to everybody from the C.S. Lewis Institute in Atlanta and Dallas for helping out behind the scenes. This was streamed live on our Facebook pages, so if you want to go back and rewatch it, great. Go for it and watch them there. And I will try to download this video and the text thread that some of you have asked for, and email it out to everybody who joined us, so you can revisit this as you go back and reread them in the proper order. Thanks for setting us straight on that. Okay, everybody, have a good night, and we'll see you again in about a month.